So home is at the center of the heart of a household. Home is literally and figuratively where the heart is. And there are three things we know to be true. Millions of Americans lack affordable housing and are willing to put up with a variety of unhealthy conditions just to have a shelter. This is hastening the demise of many of these homes and putting far many more at great risk for damage and destruction. And we know that the legacy of racism and environmental injustice and rampant income disparity has put frontline communities at greater risk to climate hazards. We just sent 2 laypersons to the Earth's outer limits this week. We have the know-how, the funding, and the tools to change this equation. We just need the will and the executive direction to get there. Disasters uproot whole communities, damaging homes and infrastructure on a scale rarely experienced before. We know that structural damage to a building is aggravated by climate conditions. The compounding and exponential impacts of heat, fires, floods, and wind events are creating hazardous conditions unknown to us in modern times. We know we must not only seek to mitigate this risk, but build housing that is flexible and adaptive to the changing conditions we face. We used to build like this. As Dr. Fernando Abruna, who is with us tonight, one of my heroes, will tell us, we used to build like this with windows that were operable and open to the natural light, with materials often locally originated that are waterproof and solid as a rock, quite literally. We now build plastic homes that melt without air conditioning and starve occupants of clean air and light, that mold up when a rainstorm comes and burn down when fires come, and cease to function when the grid goes down. And when there are not enough affordable homes available, this impacts local economies. Service workers have to commute hours to get to work. Teachers live out of district and can't come to PTA meetings. First responders have to travel to work, all of which creates havoc on households and lives and economies and our nation. We also know that communities must step forward to support housing, multifamily, single family, owned, rented, with infrastructure that will protect it. For example, New Orleans is building new pump stations to deflood housing in the floodplain. Miami is elevating roads and building flood walls to protect housing in Miami Beach. New York City is rezoning communities to ensure housing is protected, and solar is reaching the far corners of the nation's communities, from tribes to rural communities from Alaska to Hawaii, to ensure that housing is energized. This clash of environmental and structural injustice and the climate crisis reveals to us that we need a holistic review and restructuring of policies, of institutions and systems that reduce and increase the fragility of our nation. And our nation suffers when we don't do anything. We have an opportunity before us with the new presidential administration to change this equation and save the millions of homes and lives and communities that depend on this. As we will hear tonight from our dear colleagues, we will hear from leaders across the nation and the world that are actually practicing solutions and leadership that leads to significant change. Some of my personal heroes are with us tonight to tell us what their vision is and what they are actually executing as practitioners. And in the vein of Resiliency 21, we seek to lift up the voices of those practicing and executing upon their vision. They experience successes, failures, wins, and losses, but they come back, they step up, and they move forward. They are enriched and inspired to do this work because they know how important home is to the communities they serve. We serve. I could not be happier to welcome Corey Solo, who is the Deputy Director for Environmental Justice at the White House Council on Environmental Quality. Corey is a Capitol Hill veteran with over a decade advising multiple House Democratic members. And at the heart of her work is a commitment to stand alongside overburdened and underserved communities to advance equitable environmental, and climate policy. As I said before, we have the executive direction and the will today to do what needs to be done. Corey, thank you so much for being with us. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Laurie and Stewart and everyone at Resilience 21 for allowing me to join you. Thank you so much for everyone joining, whether it is earlier in your day or in your evening, for being with us right now. I send regards from Dr. Cecilia Martinez, CEQ Senior Director for Environmental Justice, who is scheduled to be with you all this evening. But I am very honored to be with you to discuss the Biden administration's whole of government approach to environmental justice. Before I get into specifics about what we are doing in the Biden administration, I do want to take a moment to talk about how we got here. As Laurie just talked about, for too long, communities of color, low-income communities, indigenous people, or members of tribal nations across our country have been disproportionately harmed by exposure to environmental pollutants, unsustainable energy systems, underinvestment in infrastructure and services, and the degradation of nature. The human toll of this inequality is shown in the disproportionately high rates of asthma among young Black Americans, disproportionately high rates of lead poisoning in children of color, and other unacceptable disparities. Simply put, for too many people, the places where they live, work, play, pray, and learn are not safe nor healthy. And too often, these same communities are left out of the decision-making processes, or the last to be included in the transition to a healthy, resilient, and sustainable future. President Biden has made it clear that his administration will chart a new and better course, one that incorporates equity and justice for historically overburdened and underserved communities throughout the administration's policy initiatives. President Biden is committed to securing environmental justice and spurring economic opportunity for communities that have been historically marginalized and overburdened by pollution and underinvestment in housing, transportation, water and wastewater infrastructure, and healthcare. And his approach to this work is guided by a couple of his core beliefs. First, that every person has a fundamental right to breathe clean air and drink clean water. And second, that for too many people, we have failed to deliver on these basic protections. Correcting these historic wrongs will require a long-term commitment, but acknowledging the need for change is a critical first step. That's why President Biden created the first ever White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, made up of 26 longtime environmental justice advocates, experts, researchers, and practitioners from across the country. Over the course of 2 months, this advisory council held 3 public meetings and devoted countless hours to develop recommendations to support the entire federal government's effort to address current and historic environmental injustices. And we at CEQ and across the federal family are actively reviewing these recommendations. Importantly, the Advisory Council's recommendations reiterate how vital community and stakeholder engagement and input are as we develop equitable policies. This Advisory Council is just one part of the Biden administration's commitment to environmental justice. We know we must take a holistic look at the impacts of our policy choices. And because of this, the president has also established the White House Environmental Justice Interagency Council, in Executive Order 14008 on tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad. The president asked CEQ Chair Brenda Mallory to lead this council. The council, which is composed of over a dozen agencies and offices, is tasked with developing and implementing the federal government strategy to address environmental injustice by consulting with the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council and with local environmental justice leaders. The Interagency Council will develop clear performance metrics to ensure accountability and publish an annual public scorecard on its implementation. But it doesn't stop there. My colleagues at CEQ, many of whom I have learned are on this call, are working with every single agency to take a whole of government approach to pursue environmental justice while addressing climate change. And I am especially excited to be joining you this evening because just yesterday, we took a very key step toward achieving the president's historic commitment to environmental justice and released interim implementation guidance for the Justice 40 initiative. The Justice 40 initiative is a whole of government effort to ensure that federal agencies work with states and local communities to make good on President Biden's promise to deliver at least 40% of the overall benefits from federal investments in clean energy and climate to disadvantaged communities. The guidance lays the foundation for how federal agencies can immediately leverage existing resources, Specifically, the guidance introduces measures to guide agencies on their path to implementing Justice 40, launches the Justice 40 pilot program, and includes accountability and transparency measures to ensure agencies are working to reach the Justice 40 goal. As I just mentioned, 21 priority programs have been identified as pilot programs in the Justice 40 initiative. These pilot programs will kickstart the Justice 40 initiative across the federal government and provide a blueprint for implementation of the Justice 40 initiative for other programs and agencies. The guidance also directs relevant federal agencies to identify the benefits of programs beyond this initial list and included in the Justice 40 initiative, to propose methods to calculate and report on reaching the 40% goal, and to develop plans to engage with communities. The Justice 40 initiative has the potential to deliver tangible, positive benefits to disadvantaged communities by investing in legacy pollution cleanup, clean energy and transportation, quality housing, and more. We will help address our nation's legacy of injustice. And I'm incredibly proud of yesterday's announcement. As you can see, there is no doubt that it's a busy time for the Biden administration and for all of us at CEQ. And we're very lucky to have partners deeply committed to this work, a federal family that has been working for decades during different administrations to address environmental injustice, and everyone joining us right now who is working to prioritize equitable policies and equity, environmental justice, so we can make real, tangible change in people's lives. Thank you again so much for having me, and thank you for all the work that you're doing. I look forward to hearing more from this evening's discussion and learning from all of you.
Laurie, thanks very much. And we have all said it many times that we cannot have resilience without equity. And we are very, very grateful for you coming and bringing the messages that you have. And it's also from the very start of this group, when it was that ragtag group, putting together the actions that we proposed, we were very, very equity leaning in all the resilience conversations that we're having. And we welcome you to come back and speak with us and update us. I know there are going to be questions that we could forward to you if you're willing, because I know you have to leave us before the end of the period. But we're very grateful for that, and I think it is a telling moment for us also, because we know that big bills are coming, big changes are coming, and there's a lot that we're trying to do to be able to move it on to the very next level of equity and resilience. So we really appreciate your time tonight. And if you can stay a few minutes and listen to the rest of the speakers, that'd be great. But I do know you have to leave. So thanks again for joining us, Corey.
Thank you, and please send those questions my way. Be happy to stay engaged with all of you. Thank you.
Great. Great. You heard it. Put them in the chat, and we'll gather them up since we're recording this. So what we'll do now is we will move to our speakers that we have described in the announcements, and I'm hoping that all of you saw the various emails and LinkedIn posts and tweets that went out, and that's why you're here tonight. We'd love to continue to grow this movement and this group as we continue to push on all the various elements. And as Laurie said, and Corey kind of reiterated, we want this whole of government. We want this to be intertwined between HUD and FEMA and EPA and DOT. So we're very much looking forward to the conversation tonight, because in fact, the way that this group came together and this set of speakers and the topic of housing is a place where we can do that kind of weaving and have that conversation, because it's already at a point where we have to move very, very fast. So without further comments, I am going to have Jane Gilbert, who is the Miami-Dade Chief Heat Officer, but also the former CRO from the city of Miami, kick us off. We will then move to Fernando Abruna, who is master architect and has been working on resilience with Laurie and others who are on the call in Puerto Rico. And after Fernando, we will go to Elizabeth Hausler, who is the founder and CEO of Build Change, and she has got an exciting global view that also is circling back to the US context and has an amazing model that we have worked with in my 100 Resilient Cities days going back some time, in Medellin and other places. And then to wrap us up, we have Janelle Williams, who is with the Atlanta Federal Reserve and is a senior advisor there in the community and economic development area, and somebody that I know you will be inspired by. So I am going to turn it over to Jane, and then we will move through each speaker, and looks like we're gonna get a good chunk of conversation time at the end as well. So Jane, over to you.
Thank you, Stewart, and thank you, Laurie, for that really inspiring kickoff set of comments, and Corey for your work. It's a real honor to speak to this audience tonight, and what Stewart, Laurie, Marissa had asked me to do, or all of us, is to define what we think about what is resilient housing, what we do, and then some best practices. And so, you know, Laurie set the stage. When I think of resilience in my community, Greater Miami, housing is front and center in that concern and in the priorities, because we both have a affordability crisis of over 50% of our population is cost burdened. That population also, as a result of being cost burdened by their housing, has no savings in the event of a disaster and could be significantly set them back, and all sorts of other health and quality of life risks as a result of some of their housing stock. In fact, about a third of our population in Miami lives in housing stock that was built before current hurricane codes and has not been updated. And so if we had a major hurricane hit, we could have close to a third of our population at significant risk in terms of their housing. So I think I define resilient housing very broadly. Affordability is critical though, safe, healthy, sustainable. So as Stewart was talking about the need and call for this interdepartmental collaboration, it exists all the way down at the local government level as well. We need it between our emergency management and our housing and community development folks, our human services folks, and our resilience and sustainability folks. They need to all be working together at the city level. It involves where your housing is, not just the building itself, but how your land use plans in terms of making sure it's out of harm's way in terms of flooding, or what the overall urban heat island is. Certainly within the energy burdens, that it's energy, water efficient, that you have redundancy in terms of backup power. Protecting against all the potential.
I mean, do they have to idle, first of all? And second of all, why do they have to paint? Do they have to idle like that?
Can you please mute? Can you please
mute? Anyway, and social capacity is critical. So that community in which making sure we're building communities within these housing structures and neighborhoods that have the capacity to check on neighbors and know how to respond in the event of disasters. And unfortunately, the world heard about recently, we're just starting to learn about the new resilience concerns related to our Surfside condo collapse. And that is, we're just starting to unpack the various regulations and systems and procedures we need to put in place to make sure at a county and all our municipalities that they are enforcing code at the time of construction. That, you know, Miami-Dade and Broward County are only two counties in the whole state of Florida that even have a 40-year certification requirement. But we need to make sure that 40-year certification requirement is done with integrity and strong enforcement. And we've already, the county and many of the municipalities have done a complete review of all of the buildings in our area that are up for that 40-year certification and cited violations and even had to evacuate a couple of buildings. So it is, and to think about how do we incentivize and make sure our condo owners associations are building in their budgets for maintenance and repairs and making sure that those get followed through. Again, we're still in recovery mode, in response mode actually, and beginning recovery mode, and it will be, stay tuned to see what else we learn in that process. So what do? This is a new role, Chief Heat Officer. It's new for me, it's new for the county, it's actually new for the world. And it came about through a series of conversations that happened with the Arched Rock Resilience Center, Extreme Heat Resilience Alliance, and our new county mayor, Janelle Williams, about the increasing concerns of extreme heat globally, but also here locally in Miami-Dade County. And our mayor committed to it. We will soon hear announcements of chief heat officers in Athens, Greece, and Freetown, Sierra Leone. And our mayor, Janelle Williams, reached out to many mayors across the US at the start of our heat season in May to ask them to join a social media and awareness campaign around heat awareness in 12 cities, have jumped on the opportunity to increase awareness around heat. So, but the concerns around heat not just came up with the Extreme Heat Resilience Alliance, but locally. After Hurricane Irma, we had 12 fatalities in the county just north of us in a nursing home due to heat risk after a hurricane. And so we statewide and county put in regulations to require assisted living nursing homes to have a generator with fuel for 3 to 4 days after. Anyway, it's a critical piece to require that in other types of buildings. But that raised a lot of awareness locally and about other vulnerable populations. A climate health and equity coalition formed, outreaching to our vulnerable frontline communities throughout Greater Miami about their concerns about climate change, and extreme heat and displacement were their top two concerns. We also have formed an urban heat research group with our local universities. So I'm going to be responsible for coordinating and accelerating existing heat protection and mitigation efforts, and for initiating new initiatives that will address it. While I report directly to the mayor, I work very closely and with support from our County Chief Resilience Officer, Jim Murley, and his whole team. So in this role, we're involved with both short-term actions, just like a resilience officer, you're building the train while you're driving it. So we have short-term actions to look at our heat advisories and our emergency management procedures, are expanding our citizen emergency response team training, and seeking more resources for our tree planting efforts. But in the long run, we're putting together a whole task force and a lot of outreach to really do a deep dive on what else we can be doing. I can guarantee that resilient housing is going to be a key component of that. We had 108 heat index this afternoon for a few hours, and I was out at a community event and with our resilience staff, and they had just done some door hanging in the neighborhood and commented to me that a number of the houses did not have AC on. So we know we have significant communities at risk today in the housing. So what are some of our best practices? Oh, and one other thing on heat, I'm also working nationally with various groups, including the Global Cool Cities, and I mentioned the Extreme Heat Resilience Alliance and the Smart Surfaces Coalition, to send a joint letter on heat action to the Biden administration. And I've asked Stewart and Laurie to send out to the attendees tonight a copy of that letter. And if you're interested in signing on, we'll also give you that information on how to sign on to that letter. I thought it's very equity focused. Housing is a component of those recommendations. And so I encourage you to take a look at that. So some of our local best practices are with one that I cooked up with Laurie Schoeman many years ago, called Keep Safe Miami, and it's a partnership with our Resilient 305 coalition. So Miami-Dade County, City of Miami, and Miami Beach are all participants, and enterprise community partners. We received grant funding to create a toolkit for affordable housing owners and operators to assess their portfolios and then do a deep dive in those properties that are most vulnerable, to do a housing audit. And they get a guidance document on funding and financing solutions, as well as some matching funding from both the City of Miami and we're looking at other incentives as well. The county is also looking to use that guide as part of their review of their own properties that are not going to be undergoing full redevelopment as part of their rental assistance development program. And I just want to, the last thing I'm going to say, I know I've probably talked too long, but is that with our housing department, our public housing and community development, they are converting 6,400 units of public housing through a public-private partnership redevelopment to create mixed use, resilient, sustainable housing that is to LEED standards, but also has a whole very extensive disaster preparedness plan, backup generator power, et cetera. And they're going to be creating, in addition to improved and healthy, safe units of the 6,400, an additional 10 to 20,000 mixed use units as part of that development. So it will greatly accelerate our availability of affordable and resilient and sustainable and healthy housing.
Come inside.
With that, I'm going to hand over. I've probably taken up way more than my time. Thank you.
Cliff, come here.
Thanks very much, Jane. Always inspiring and on the front edge with this work. I want to quickly turn it over to Fernando Abruna from Puerto Rico. Take it away, Fernando.
Fernando, you have to unmute.
Okay, thanks for coming back inside.
Okay,
There you go.
I
Perfect.
hope you can hear me now. Okay, thank you all, and especially Stewart and my good friend Laurie, who I met when she came down to Puerto Rico right after Hurricane Maria with the Keep Safe Handbook project that was planned and delivered successfully to through the involvement of communities, school architecture, many architects, engineers, the works. Everybody got involved in that effort, and we finally have a Keep Safe Handbook for Puerto Rico. Tonight, I'm going to be showing you a small, very modest house that we did for Caño Martin Peña, which is a vulnerable community in Santurce. And what I'll do, I'll give some general explanations of what I believe sustainability and resilient housing is, and I'll go through a quick tour of the house and its features. And at the end, I'll I'll throw in some ideas on lessons learned and things that we can do. So we were asked as participants in this forum what resilient housing is, and this is the the shortest way I could describe what a resilient housing is. Affordable, sustainable, and equitable units that can adapt to their context in the very wide sense, cultural, economic, political, social, cultural, etc. Survive and spring back to service immediately after catastrophic events through passive survivability mode, which I'll explain in a while, with the owners and the community's own resources and autonomy, which means that resilient housing takes as a point of departure the possibility of the owners taking care of their own and being empowered to make decisions that will affect them and their community. Now, one question that I always make myself when we deal with resilient housing is that question you see at the the lower part of the slide. Can we provide the means to an independent, productive life and not one dependent on charity? Because many times when we get involved in resilient housing or even sustainable housing or even just regular housing for the disadvantaged and the people who don't have the resources, is that we need to go to third parties. We have to go to non-governmental organizations. We have to go to nonprofits and almost beg for them to help us. You know, is there a way that we can empower communities and the owners of those houses to be able to do that on their own without being dependent on charity? Is that a possibility that we can explore? What you're seeing here now is a very simple floor plan of what we developed. The program was to design and build an affordable 2-bedroom, expandable to 3, sustainable and resilient dwelling prototype for victims of Hurricane Maria in the vulnerable, flood-prone Caño Martin Peña River communities. There's a set of 8 different communities that are affected by the Caño, and it's flood prone, as I said, and every time it rains, people go through very, very difficult times just dealing with the water levels that get into their houses. Now, what we're showing is a fully furnished and equipped prototype for $95K. That was our budget. I just wanted to contrast that with the average cost for an unfurnished 3-bedroom unit in Puerto Rico. These are statistics from April 2021, so those are relatively recent. And I think considering the features that we were able to incorporate into the house, a very modest one, it's just 528 square feet. You know, typically and popularly, if you build a house of 500 square feet or less, people tend to call them tiny houses. I don't want to call this one a tiny house because it's larger than 500, it's 528, but also because it tends to give a sense of diminishing the importance of the project itself. It's not a tiny house. It's a house that's very well designed and offers many possibilities for their owners and their users. Now, in 10 minutes, I'm going to try to summarize some of the major components of this house. It has a solar emergency generator, which was like a blessing in disguise. Originally, we were planning on installing a 2-kilowatt photovoltaic system with batteries, but our budget was not enough to cover that. So we discovered this small, very rather cheap or available unit that gives the possibility of electrical resiliency after a catastrophic event. And at the very end, I'll show you what we call the resiliency kit for Puerto Rico, which I believe can be done with a relatively low budget. We also have a utility-fed potable water cistern, a rooftop installed cistern, a rainwater cistern inline water heater, composting toilet, and an R20 insulated roof. The house is PV and battery system ready. So in the future, if the owners want to expand their possibilities energy-wise, they can do so. And it's also ready for a solar water heater. On the right, you can see how the house looks like. It's basically if I may go back to the floor plan, this measures 12 feet wide by 40 feet long. That was the original measurement. With the participation of community leaders and the beneficiaries, we ended up with 42 feet. They felt that the space that we had originally designed for the kitchen, dining, and living area was too small. So we were able to negotiate that with 2 additional feet. And on the right, you can see an interior patio and an interior garden. This is a wall extension that gives a better presence urban-wise. You know, if you walk through the street, you will see a more presentable house in the sense that it has a wider facade. Had it been just this little space here, which is mainly the main area for the house. After you enter the garden, it's a perfumed garden. It has a vegetation that gives very nice smells, and then you have an interior patio which has folding doors that open up this space, and it looks much bigger than it actually is. This is just 12 feet wide. Here it's reduced to barely 10 feet. But once you open those folding doors, it makes a big difference on how you perceive the interior and the exterior space. It also allows for daylighting, natural ventilation. It also provides the necessary air changes to confront COVID in the sense that it gives you fresh air all the time. And the back part, the shaded area that you see, would be the growth to a 3rd bedroom, which would include what is now built as a half bathroom, including a composting toilet and a sink. So this is how it was intended to be built. This is how we designed it. Here you see the 2K PV system, which we were not able to do, but I just explained that we ended up with that solar emergency generator, which gives us that advantage. Passive survivability, which is one of the main concepts incorporated into the design. Can a house provide a healthy environment after a catastrophic event based on the properties of nature, sun, wind, rain, clouds, plants, daylight, moonlight, color, gravity, others? Some time ago, we did design a house, a small, almost a little less than 500 square feet house, where part of the passive survivability ideas were incorporated, including a moon lamp that shines beautifully during full moon nights. So those are aspects that need to be incorporated as part of the living experience. You know, we typically talk about sustainable and resilient and affordable housing, and we end up with many times we end up with practical ideas, but the poetry of the space that can be achieved, we just forget about it. Now, this is the entrance, the balcony. This is a rough neighborhood, and the chairs and tables that you see there are relocated every morning. So if you want to enjoy your balcony, you use them in the morning, and then you relocate them in the back in the interior patio. This would be the entrance in access with the interior patio. We go in and see the perfumed garden. We see the pergola that connects to the interior space. At the end of this space, on the right side, that peach color you see there, that's the half bathroom that would be enclosed as part of the 3rd bedroom when it grows. And this is the area where the door opening would come in the future, and that would connect the next wall would come right in here, and the little bathroom would remain as part of that third bedroom. This is the solar generator we were talking about, just to give you a sense of scale. It's about the size of what we used to use, CPUs, if you remember those for desktop computers. It's about that size, and it gives the opportunity and the possibilities of the owner to run a 1 kilowatt-hour per day refrigerator 24/7. And it also gives you additional energy to run maybe a microwave oven and a couple lights, maybe a fan. It's a very simple house, very modest. This is the bathroom. This is one of the bedrooms before we put in the beds. As you can see, very well illuminated by daylighting. The transoms above allow for the light to bounce from the ceiling and illuminate the whole space. You might be asking why the ceiling is yellow. It's yellow because light that reflects from a yellow surface changes in frequency, and the wavelength of that light reduces mitigates the presence of insects. And this is an area where the water table is very high. As I mentioned, it's very flood prone area. So mosquitoes are always a concern. So we incorporated not only yellow ceilings, but also yellow lights throughout the exterior spaces. This is another view looking from the small bathroom that I showed you in previous slides, looking into the dining and living area. Again, looking into the dining living area. The door you see on this wall leads to the bedroom that I showed you before. Another view, looking from the kitchen to the dining, living, and the patio area. As you can see, it's very well lit. There's not one light on as we took this photograph. It's just plain daylight. And if you look at the windows, the windows go almost to the floor. So that allows for excellent natural ventilation and daylighting. Now, the sustainable kit, home resiliency kit, we have separated into these 4 major components. The solar emergency generator, which is around $1,500. The utility cistern, utility fed cistern on the rooftop, which is 500 gallons, and the rainwater tank, 200 gallons, almost around 1,500 too. A composting toilet, close to 1,500, and that includes a French drain and the toilet itself, and a solar water heater close to that. So we believe that for very small, very modest, very budget restricted houses, a $6,000 budget would give us this resiliency components that would allow for people to have electric and hydric resiliency after a major catastrophic event. We went through Hurricane Maria, and I was fortunate enough that I had developed a house, my own house, that's been disconnected from the grid for 22 years now. And we were able to spend 45 consecutive days there. I normally spend my time where I permanently live and where I have my offices in the old city of San Juan. And it came out as a revelation, you know, just being able to operate those 45 days that we were in the old city. We were without any water or any electricity, and we were having a relatively comfortable space. And at the end, my wife and myself had what we call a survivor's guilt, and that really pushed us to develop another project called Casa Rescate. But I'm not going to go. I'm not going to explain Casa Rescate. I just want to talk about some of the lessons that we learned. One would be the creation of a bonding endowment to cover payment and performance bonds and builders risk insurance for small crew builders. we found that that was a major difficulty that we encountered when we were looking for potential contractors to do the actual construction. And if we do get a bonding endowment, we could make sure that small crew builders, maybe even community builders, could be awarded the work that can be done in that same community. Exempt low-income projects from municipal taxes and fees, that's a given. Pro bono work protected by the Good Samaritan law, even under non-emergency scenarios. Here in Puerto Rico, I don't know about the States, but here in Puerto Rico, the Good Samaritan law operates for 60 days after a catastrophic event. Hurricane Maria was with us for about a year, and we're still feeling some of the difficulties that we encountered and that have not yet been solved. I believe that we can also create a national library of public domain plans for families who cannot afford professional services. Those plans would be donated by architects and engineers. I believe that many of us have designed many houses that we won't be using again. So I believe many architects would be willing to donate those plans and make them available as and put them in the public domain so that people without the resources can actually have a very well-designed house. Ones should subsidize needs. I believe that in order for all housing units to be able to have a photovoltaic renewable energy system, if you have someone that would install a larger than required or a larger than necessary system, you might be able to put an additional cost premium on those units in order to subsidize the smaller ones, like the ones we just designed. You know, if we have this program on, those excess monies that would be spent for larger photovoltaic systems would make it possible for these smaller units to have the 2K system, 2 kilowatt system that we talked about. And we also think that if you finance PV solar systems through the house's 30-year mortgage, you would get instant benefits, and the savings would be larger than what you would pay when you amortize the cost of that system for 30 years. So that would be a very simple thing to do, except that banking institutions normally require for that to happen to be permanent part of the structure. But I believe that that can be worked out. And in the end, the love you take is equal to the love you make. If those of you who remember the Beatles, many years ago, I wanted to finish this presentation with this slide because in the end, we architects, as we get involved with the community and we get involved with this kind of a project, it has to be done with love. And housing, I believe, as an architect, is one of the most important building types that we as architects can get involved with. If you compare, just to make an extreme comparison, housing is a need, a casino is a luxury, but they're both building types. And we as architects have to deal with both of them at times, right? But housing definitely has to be one of the major concerns as we designers and architects work with. I think that's the end of my presentation, and I have a few more slides that I will not be showing, but I'll leave them as available for anyone who wants to see additional information that we developed as part of this project. So I think I'll stop sharing, and that's the end of my presentation.
Fernando, I don't know if you could follow even half of what was being said in the chat, but the smiles and especially the grinning from Laurie Schoeman should have told you how much this presentation was resonating with everyone. And we've got questions for you at the end, but just absolutely stunning and really inspiring at the house level. Which is incredible. Great. So let's move on to Elizabeth Hausler, the founder and CEO of Build Change, who's going to talk to us about her work in safety globally and bringing that home to the United States. Elizabeth, over to you.
I'm so glad to be here. Thank you so much, Stewart. Thanks, Laurie, for the invitation. What a pleasure. I run Build Change. It's a 16-year-old systems change catalyst in the field of disaster resilient housing and schools. Just a quick rundown of our impacts. Over 90,000 buildings are more disaster resilient and healthier because of our work. We've reached over 500,000 people with a better house, a better school, or a job in construction. And we've helped to protect over $1.8 billion in housing infrastructure assets around the world. So yes, of course, I'm in the camp that housing is infrastructure. And what's my definition of resilient housing? When I started working in this field 20 years ago, it was all about disaster resilience for me. It was all about preventing the house from collapsing, whether it's single family or multifamily house, preventing the house from collapsing and killing or injuring its occupants in an earthquake in the early days. Hurricanes came later. But through these many years of listening to the needs and the dreams of the homeowners and becoming a homeowner myself, I now look at it more holistically and recognize that housing really is the ultimate protection for families. So I want to share, the Build Change Resilient Housing Wheel really quickly here. Hopefully you can see that. So this is a poster we developed for the TED Countdown lead up to COP26 as part of our climate resilient housing advocacy. We basically just dumped what we think resilient housing means into 3 buckets. One is protection from all disasters, whether that's earthquake or wind or fire, extreme heat and cold, heavy rains, break-ins and pests. And the second bucket is basic needs. So light and power, indoor air quality, these things that Fernando was articulating so beautifully to us. Being able to sleep at night, especially in a safe environment for women, especially. I remember very clearly, I don't think I'll ever forget this, one of the first homeowners we worked with in Aceh in Indonesia after the Indian Ocean tsunami. After we finished her house, she basically said, now I can sleep at night. Very simple. And very much to the point about what resilient housing meant to her. And the third bucket here is growth and asset development. Housing should be a place of financial security. In our markets, there are a lot of home businesses run out of homes, especially by women. Oftentimes, folks are using house as a rental unit, a way of increasing their incomes. And it most certainly should be something that enables growth of wealth at an equal pace, especially for people of color who've been excluded and discriminated against because of unfair housing practices and redlining in the United States. Who am I? Well, I have a PhD in civil engineering from UC Berkeley, and I grew up in a small town outside of Chicago. Neither of my parents went to college. My sister and I worked for my dad as bricklayers. That was our summer job in high school and college. My dad owned a small business in the construction industry. So I've done the masonry work on a fair number of buildings, homes and other buildings in the United States. Build Change is expanding to the US now. It's a very exciting moment for us, but most of my professional experience has been outside of the US, in Asia, Latin America, Caribbean, places including Indonesia, China, Haiti, the Philippines, Nepal, and Colombia. So we work after disasters in a build back better mindset, but more often these days, we're working to prevent disasters in a build better before mindset. And I can tell you, we can prevent disasters. We can prevent disasters. It can be done with the right combination of political will, of people's motivation, of access to financing and technology. Okay, so I want to give you an example from Colombia, starting with political will. Strengthening buildings before the disaster must be prioritized at the highest levels. The Colombian government has shown some real leadership here. President Duque's administration green-lighted and funded the Casa Digna, Vida Digna program, Dignified Life, Dignified House. It's an ambitious initiative to strengthen and improve 600,000 homes. And it bundles multiple objectives: poverty alleviation, improved sanitation, disaster risk reduction, mainly for earthquakes, dense urban environments like the one you see behind me, this kind of neighborhood. Build Change has supported relevant national ministries as well as city level housing departments to set up the systems needed to evaluate these kind of buildings, to design and cost the retrofits, to link to the grant disbursement, and to check construction quality. So it may sound a little bit top down, but we actually started from the ground up by retrofitting a few of these homes, showing it could be done. How much does it cost? Getting direct input from homeowners in the process, for figuring out where the bottlenecks were in the regulatory process and the permit process, and working with government stakeholders to implement changes to those processes. And then taking the show on the road. Last year, our Columbia team did this epic road trip during COVID-19, during the pandemic, right, around to support the rollout of this government program. So this is the start of something big in Colombia. 26 million Colombians are in need of better, stronger, safer housing. The World Bank is also involved here as a source of financing through their global program for resilient housing, which we supported them to launch a few years ago. And it looks like Casa Digna, Vida Digna will actually span presidential administrations. So it's a great live example of political leadership, of the importance of local champions to push this forward, and this public-private intersection that's necessary in something like this. This couldn't happen just with the public sector. It couldn't happen if it doesn't work in the private sector, if builders and contractors can't make it work. And of course, the homeowners need to be engaged. All of these agencies and entities acting in unison. So, you know, the US already has some similar programs. We've heard about Keep Safe Miami. In addition to that, the California Earthquake Authority runs an earthquake retrofit program that's already reached 15,000 homeowners with grants and technical assistance. Salt Lake City has the Fix the Bricks program, really informative seminar just this afternoon about retrofitting unreinforced masonry buildings in Utah. I encourage you to check that out. Boulder County, not too far from where I live here in suburban Denver, has a fire mitigation program. Again, same mix of grants plus TA. South Carolina has the Safe Home program. I'm going on and on here, but the point is there are innovative programs out there already that are working, that have proof of concept, but they need to be scaled. In some cases, I think there's a need to reduce administrative bottlenecks to really get these programs to reach the millions and millions of homeowners that need them. I also wonder if these programs are reaching mostly early adopters at this stage, or people who are more tech savvy or more construction savvy, and more can be done to reach everyone, to reach the full range of income levels, that especially those with the least resources, to be able to strengthen their home. These programs also need more funding. I can say this. I feel like I can say this because I'm like working on international programs and not actually working in the US yet. But some of these programs just got passed over for BRIC funding for building resilient infrastructure in communities. I'm trying to understand how that happened, but you know, I've got a lot to learn, I guess, about how it works in the United States. So anyway, there may be a need to be very creative about stacking or bundling financing to pull from FEMA, from HUD, from EPA, the various different sources and resources that are available to make a house more resilient, either for energy efficiency, for water usage, for disaster resilience. Pull all of these things together to make it so the entire house is disaster resilient. We have a long way to go. I think there's something like 140 million housing units in the US, and at least half of them are in areas prone to one or more major disaster, right? And I don't think heat's not even included in that, I don't think.
No.
So so political will, we've got to have political will. That's, you know, we can't make change at scale unless policy changes, unless funding is directed toward these issues in big ways. But we also have to harness people's motivation, right? We've got to motivate folks to take time out of their daily lives to do something, to do a home improvement project to make their house better. So here's what we found in terms of what motivates homeowners to take those next steps. Incentives, subsidies, grants, tax breaks, insurance premium reductions, incentives, and making it easy to apply, to work through the process, reducing the paperwork burden. In Guatemala, we've worked in the Barrio Mio program, and we found that folks in urban and peri-urban areas, maybe they have a single-story building they could strengthen that ground floor to expand to a second story that adds rental income. It also reduces impacts on the need for more utilities because it's a vertical expansion versus a horizontal one. So we found in our work internationally that growth, changes that improve people's daily lives are such better motivators than fear or shame. These just don't seem to work. It's better to harness that desire to expand and to grow and to increase the value of the asset. All right, I want to take my last couple of minutes to talk about equity. So we were given the prompt by Laurie, how can the lens of resilience shape our investment priorities in housing? I think we should also be asking ourselves the same question about equity. How can the lens of equity shape our investment priorities in housing? And with us in our international work, a lot of it is about gender equity. Housing is a women's issue. In our international markets, women and children are 14 times more likely to die in a disaster than men. They're often running a business out of the home. If you visit our website or our YouTube channel, you can see many stories about women homeowners, women business owners, women borrowers. Housing is a women's issue, and we need to trust women as leaders, as engineers, as construction workers, as stewards of their family's safety, as responsible borrowers, and not just sources of sweat equity. The path to resilient housing absolutely has to go through women. Second, I want to talk about economic equity and equal access to financing. The majority of Build Change's clients worldwide are folks in the bottom third of the pyramid, people making maybe $200, $300, maybe $1,000 a month, generally living in informal neighborhoods, maybe didn't have building inspection during construction, overall distrust or lack of faith in the government and the financial system, maybe no access to insurance. And so we've always been oriented around making that knowledge and financing available so that everyone can access disaster resilient housing. In the Philippines, there's an absence of government subsidy as opposed to our Columbia program where there is a government subsidy available. So in the Philippines, we've been working with several microfinance institutions to offer a very unique, innovative home strengthening loan product bundled with technical assistance at interest rates that are attractive, repayment periods that work for the homeowner, and can be done incrementally. So maybe this year it's tying down the roof for hurricane resilience. Maybe next year it's adding new walls for earthquake resistance. So a lot of opportunities there to scale. One last point about racial equity and data. Being the builder and engineer that I am, I like data. I like understanding the details of buildings. But one of the things that's made Build Change successful over the years is that we've been able to take action with limited information. We've been able to trust our engineering judgment to look at buildings like you can see in my background here and to figure out a way of meeting folks where they are in that condition and strengthening those buildings. So we've got to be able to make decisions with limited information and get things done. Now, but engineers, municipal officials, policymakers, we all need data to understand the building types, to understand the building inventories, to do cost benefit analysis. But I think there's a couple of risks here. One is that nothing gets done, that we get paralyzed by indecision. The other is that there's a risk by seeking this information, by inventorying buildings or by tagging them for improvement. If this is done without equity front and center, without the building owners themselves, not only at the table, but leading the process, that it ends up displacing more people, reducing property values, particularly among communities of color. We cannot allow our need for data, our need to inventory or identify vulnerable buildings that need seismic other upgrades to become the new redlining. So I fully support having resilient housing part of the environmental justice agenda. It absolutely needs to be there. And if we apply this inclusive approach based on knowledge, based on homeowners leading the process, access to financing, based on love and understanding, I loved Fernando's last slide there. It was just absolutely brilliant. I think I didn't really realize how much love was part of the process until one of our homeowners pointed that out to me. It's just this necessity to meet people where they are and to work with them with the best, to make the best situation the best house they can have. So thank you so much. Continue to engage with us. Please give me a shout, Elizabeth@buildchange.org. Come to our launch event, September 2nd. We are launching our Build Change Guide to Resilient Housing, an essential handbook for government and practitioners. So look forward to see you all there. And thanks very much. Glad to be part of tonight.
So much, Elizabeth. Super inspiring, and from our time in Medellin and onward, just an amazing set of tools and practices you're now going to bring to the United States. So anxious to see what happens with all of that. Keep us posted, keep us involved. Last but not least, I am extremely happy to bring to the stage Janelle Williams from the Atlanta Federal Reserve Bank. She and I met as we were beginning pre-COVID to start to embed resilience in the work that they were doing as a kind of experiment for the region. And she comes with an amazing surrounding systems approach to what we've been talking about. So without too much more chatter on my part, because I'm going to rave about Janelle a bit, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Stewart. I want to make sure I don't disappoint anyone, particularly this time of day. So as you can tell from my accent, I am a daughter of the deep, deep South. I live in Atlanta, but I was born and raised in the beautiful island of Trinidad and Tobago, which is the southernmost island in the West Indian archipelago. And I think that's really important context that I want to share with you as we have a conversation around what does it really mean to help facilitate resilient communities, not only resilient housing, but resilient communities. The views that I'm about to share this evening reflect my own views. They do not reflect the views of the Atlanta Fed or the Federal Reserve System, and I'm not here to endorse any products or services. My name is Janelle Williams, and I'm really excited to be here and part of this dynamic panel. I'd like to share with you one of my personal stories and then fast forward to offer a system context about what we're really talking about today. Let's be honest, no one is going to die at the end of this discussion. What we're doing is important, but it's not life or death. These are not issues that are so incredibly intractable that they cannot be addressed. We have the opportunity to match skill with will and collective will so that every child and every family has the opportunity to live and thrive in stable, secure, sustainable, and healthy housing. I said that I was born in Trinidad and I was raised there for half of my life. And I was the firstborn of young teenagers who were madly in love. And it's so interesting because as I'm listening to these stories and the context around what's happening all over the world, we offer these very crude classification of what's developed, who is developing, what's certified and what isn't, but they're all inundated with biases to assess what actually is a solution and what is a challenge. While my parents were young and they were figuring out their career, they were able to secure access to help them purchase their own home. And that asset helped finance my tertiary studies, my siblings' tertiary studies, so that they were able to explore their career. And I often wonder what type of outcome I would have experienced if I was actually raised in the US. Because we know where you live determines the quality of life you experience. And so housing is not only tied to, do I have access to lead? Are there community amenities? Am I exposed to lead, not access, exposed to lead or other environmental toxins, or are there community amenities? Do I have a Whole Foods or do I have a Walmart? Those are some choices that people have to navigate. But where I live is a function of how I experience community and what that looks like. And while we're having these conversations around housing security, as we're having conversations around what it means to invest and sustain resilient housing, we have to have a conversation of what it means on the income side. Many times, as we look at some of these local economies, these regional markets, we are seeing housing costs swiftly outpace income and wage adjustments. I currently live in Atlanta, and in the past 5 years in Atlanta, we've seen on average wages increase by roughly 8%, while housing stock has increased by 48% in an MSA that is considered arguably affordable. So who are we really building housing for? And how does the archetype of the housing look different from community to community? I would also have to emphasize how important it is to also be oriented towards the fact that the way we've advanced economic development in this country and in many countries across the world, it's highly racialized, it's based on class, and it's often based on colorism and the intersection of several of these variables. And while housing is something that can be assessed as a discrete variable, it actually is the hub of how we experience our lives. And it's incredibly important to think about what types of resources, in addition to actual affordable, safe, healthy housing stock, is needed so that people would actually choose to live in these communities. And I've learned a lot of lessons along the way, particularly in place-based work, because it's so easy to be seduced into the vision of what you think is nice, what you think people who haven't received many things would want. Of course, they'd want running water. Of course, they'd love neutral shades and warm tones. But those weren't the things that I heard from residents working in their communities. They wanted access points. They wanted street lights. They wanted more pathways and walkways. And it really became clear that the things I want as I make decisions on where I want to live is actually very comparable to what any other mom wants, any working mom wants. And so, you know, my assessment around the conversation around housing, stability, security, affordability, it's really how do we really get to the crux of the matter on the harm that has been done in policies and practices that have disproportionately hurt BIPOC communities? How do we make sure that we invest resources not only to offer increased housing stock, but as we think about emerging research, which continues to show that commute time is a leading predictor for retention, that we need to make sure that housing is accessible to job centers and it's accessible to other commercial corridors so that people could live where they work and play where they live. And those are options that we actually all want. But somehow it's been so easy, and I say this as a recovering funder, to be seduced into these charitable practices where we think this is what poor people have experienced and this is what they need and this will be good enough. And you know, my assessment of these issues is really to encourage us all to continue to check the opportunities where implicit biases do show up, and how do we interrogate those assumptions, and what does that look like, and what does that mean? And that's been really important as I've continued to do work with partners, both in a place-based effort, regional and nationally, as we consider what does it mean not only to provide affordable, healthy, and sustainable housing, but to help people that live in these homes actually join the economic mainstream. I'd like to spend some time also talking to you today about some emerging trends we're seeing. And I'm very cautious to see on the heels of COVID because we're still dealing with this, but certainly, you know, there is an economic fallout. And we know there's this well-known saying, when America catches a cold, the rest of the world might catch a flu. And when we think about who in America catches a cold, several people actually catch the flu, particularly BIPOC communities that have experienced this historic disinvestment. So I'd like to share with you some of the things that we're seeing in around COVID and I think it's really important as we think about what does the market show, what's our market conditions, what's the volatility we're seeing, to really ask ourselves, who are we building this for? And not for today, 10 years from today, 15 years from today. What is the intent? And how do we really support the facilitation of community building? Not how do we build communities, how do we support the facilitation of community building? Because community is inherently about really maximizing one's sense of belonging. And that's not something you could artificially insert. That's not a transactional experience. That's a meaningful exchange and engagement. And so a couple of things I'd just like to share as we think about how to support an inclusive recovery. And the word inclusive was mentioned several times by prior speakers. We have seen, and this is from our colleagues at the Philadelphia Fed, and we've continued to see this play out on the heels of COVID, industries that are subjected to close physical proximity as much as 40% with either colleagues or clients have experienced negative fallouts from this crisis. So the industries that have been impacted include transportation, accommodation and food services, arts and entertainment, recreation, some administrative services, and retail. Now, why am I sharing this to you? Because as we think about who we're considering helping to access these resources, many of these families and residents have actually been employed by these industries. And so what does it mean for, what does affordability look like for them? What is the disposable income that they actually do have access to? And so as we think about affordability, again, really thinking about its connection to career pathways and pipelines and opportunity occupations where people are not just living check to check to check. The other thing that it's really important to acknowledge and address are some of the enduring discriminatory practices in our systems that have caused people of color to be disproportionately impacted, living in underwater homes, having negative equity in their particularly first-time homeowners, and still trying to ascertain this American dream of homeownership, which is fleeting for many families of color. And so I think it's important as we think about who this housing is for, that we also think about the markets with which these families have to navigate and the false choices that they have to make. And many times with these families living in disinvested communities, they are often victims of predatory practices. And so as we're having conversations around resiliency, it's important that we think about economic resilience, financial resilience, and we think about housing as a hub to thriving, supportive, connected communities, and understanding that we prepare these communities so that they actually can absorb the capital that's being deployed there, because there's significant disconnect. As we all know, there have been several policies that have been implemented at a federal level to think about ways to navigate this COVID crisis. And there have been mixed reviews on the efficacy of these policies and respective programs. And one of the opportunities is to really lean into intermediaries. And I think about this work comparable to an intermediary, given its posture and its position, to really think about how could this network bring the innovative and seed capital needed to do the thing that needs to happen, which doesn't necessarily occur through public dollars and public investments. I really appreciate the work and the efforts made by so many of the previous speakers who were really clear that environmental justice is racial justice, that racial equity is not only an outcome, it's a process. And I think that is really important. And as we continue to have these conversations around supporting resilient communities and thriving communities, it's also really important that we name race. And that's really key, because if we really want to see all communities thrive, all communities succeed, we have to be intentional around how we're working in those communities that have been left behind, how we're working with communities that have actually bared the burden, and they've experienced environmental extractions so that others could flourish financially. And those are real issues. As we think about a way to get to solutions, I'd also want to encourage us to think about how are we leaning on local intelligence. You know, I said earlier, and I'm really intentional about this, like my parents had me, you know, high school sweethearts, very young. And there's so many assumptions made, you know, when people hear stories or see stories of young parents and they make assessments around executive functioning skills and values. But the reality is, some of the hardest working people I know work 60 hours a week and still have to choose between the light bill and the water bill. Some of the hardest people I know live in roach-infested apartments, and they go to work every day and pay their bills on time, but they're not considered financial citizens, and there's a lack of advocacy so that they have the right to quality, stable housing. And so as we think about solutions, we have our ideas of what's worked, and there's brilliant people on this call, but I have seen some of the most innovative solutions actually been birthed from the communities that we're supposed to be doing this on behalf of. And really taking time to interrogate our process to see how do we have space for human-centered design thinking, how are we leaning on community-based participatory research and inviting people to own their outcomes and lean into shared accountability is incredibly important. And the other last thing I'll say, because I know we're really close at time, is as we're thinking about resiliency and what does that look like, I'm so excited to join future conversations around what is the win? How do we know that we've made it? What does a resilient world look like? And I don't think it's only a world that produces the pretty widgets that we appreciate and we want to see. I think it's a world where we're not necessarily even value aligned, but it's a world where we respect our values and we have clear non-negotiables that in 2021, we should not have people dying of hunger or thirst. In 2021, little girls should not have to experience assault because they're walking on streets alone with no street light parking. There's just some non-negotiables we need to agree to for a resilient world. And then back map, what are the metrics and the processes to get us there? So I'm so excited for this amazing, dynamic, evolving conversation. This is a great group of people with spectacular ideas. And I'd really love to lean in more as we unpack what does resiliency mean so that we can really thrive. You know, the last thing I'll say is that bad habits could also be enduring. They could also be resilient. And I think we've reached a point, not as a country, but as a world, to really ask ourselves as parents, as civic actors, as citizens, what type of resiliency we actually want to contribute to, what type of chapter we want to leave with our life's work. And I'm excited for us to have a conversation that challenges us to leave something that is fundamentally more powerful than what we've individually discovered. Thank you for your time.
Wow, Janelle, thank you. What a way to finish. What a way to finish. And we have a little bit of a executive decision that Laurie and I took because what we really want to do, given the rich presentations, is take some Q&A over to the LinkedIn page. So we'll start posting some of those Q&A, those questions over there, and pick up that conversation, because just as we start to close out, a reminder that Resilience 21 came together to really affect the kind of change within the new administration and inside the agencies and the way that we all work, because we're hearing a lot of what we keep saying is a good what, but how do we do it? And Janelle reminds us that there's lots of ways that seem like the how that are not the right how. And we need to change that. And we need to understand that we're missing clues and we're missing signals, and we need to fix that if we're really going to build resilience. And there's been amazing questions and comments in the chat. So I want to kind of bring us back and say, you know, Resilience 21 is here to continue to do that. Janelle, she said it, you guys all heard her, so she's not getting off this train. We'll include her in the ongoing conversations, as well as all of you. I am really interested in some of the answers that would come from the questions that we had, and there were some very specific architectural, policy, and other ones. But remember, Resilience 21 is continuing to move forward, to have our meetings with the White House, to meet with the agencies, to talk to congressional committees, and try to move everything that was said tonight into the reality, to bring those threads together and to not be resting in those individual silos, and to sort of build back as normal that we continue to do so often. So please go onto the LinkedIn page and join if you haven't already. Go to see the actions. But before we say goodbye officially, Laurie has one question that's for all of the speakers, and they each have, I think, 30 seconds, 60 seconds.
Well, Stewart, I gotta say,
before we close out.
Before we close, I just want to say, drop the mic. Drop the mic. Janelle, you just, I cannot say more to you, to Fernando, to Elizabeth, to Jane, about what you've communicated tonight, to us, to all of us here. I am just so moved. It's a dream to be able to have this conversation with all of you. And we have so much work to do together. Please tell us, what is your one piece of guidance? What do you need this administration to do in the next 3 years so that we can come to the table and see some change truly occur? If you could all just give us your 30-second guidance for the administration, we would be so grateful. This community would be.
So I was taken by all the speakers. What Janelle said about getting into our communities who have the best solutions that are, you know, people-centered design, and what Elizabeth said about the combination of incentives and making it easier to get it done. And if I was going to talk to the federal government, it's similar to my experience at a local government level. If we can integrate thinking around housing and communities to think about efficiency, affordability, and resilience together, and our investments through HUD, through FEMA, and do it with the end user in mind, with the end user as the person, is your customer, is your, and so how do we do that in a way that isn't so complicated? It's so hard to access weatherization or any of these other programs. It's so hard. How do we do it in a way that makes it easier for both communities and the ultimate end user access the benefits? And we have to come together and make it, because what's energy efficient is also resilient. What is resilient is also helps make things more affordable. So we need to keep those in mind.
Great. Fernando.
I think that building codes can be discriminatory in the sense that they can make housing affordable. Every time we go through a catastrophic event like Maria, we have new codes with new requirements, and most of the time those requirements make housing more expensive. Now the question I'm asking myself is, can we really make code compliant housing affordable? How can we do that in the face of all these new requirements as we move forward into a climate change environment that affects all housing at all levels? So my deep concern is, how do we make codes that are equitable, building codes that are really equitable, so that everyone can have a sustainable, resilient, and affordable house?
Gotcha. Dr. Hausler.
Fantastic.
Laurie. Yeah, find the money. What was it? $240 billion was in the original infrastructure bill, which is no longer in the version that's in the Senate right now. Get us back to that $240 billion for housing, right? New housing, upgrading existing housing, get that money back out there. And then get it in the hands, listen to the people who need it most, and get it in their hands. I'm repeating what Jane said, make it easy for the end user, make it about fixing all the things we've messed up in the past. You get it out there to the people who really can need it and can use it most.
Janelle.
Yeah, so I'll try to be quick, but I will say first, we need to disabuse ourselves of this scarcity narrative. And we've been conditioned to think about profit in a zero-sum lens, and it's actually not sustainable. And there are things that we can do. So there are billions being passed in infrastructure bills, but what actually happens when it gets to implementation is that those dollars get deployed to the same top actors. And like I said, equity is an outcome, but it's also a process. And if we're talking about racial equity and resilience, we have to really be intentional around who is working on behalf of these communities and who's able to actually benefit from this. So I'd like to see I would like to see increased investments into CDCs, CDFIs, and other public serving entities, so that these public dollars are not only being used to continue to propel empires. The other thing is, as we think about a field of disaster recovery, it still largely hinges on lagging indicators. And we need to seriously invest in a data infrastructure so we understand what type of housing we need, not for the next 5, 10 years, for the next 50 years and plus, and what's going to be sustainable. And really think about leading indicators around housing and community development in a much more dynamic and sophisticated way that reflects the future of work. And then the last thing I would say is, so much around housing is centered around rugged individualism. Nothing around this incentivizes community ownership, co-op ownership. And I think there's opportunities to lean into that in a dynamic way. We heard examples, and it's very evident in developing countries. Yes, those air quotes are intentional, around microfinance and IDAs. And we've actually seen the literature bear out where they're actually much more successful. So the ability to implement that in a coordinated, sustainable way is there. The commitment to do it is important. And we need to make sure we have research that doesn't just regurgitate the outcomes we're used to seeing, but begins to audit public dollars, public expenditures, and how it's being complemented with private and philanthropic dollars.
Thank you all. May your words reach the highest levels of the government, many of which are on this call tonight, and may all of our words bear truth at this time. And before I turn to Stewart, I just want to send my prayers to all of you, to our communities across the nation fighting fires, floods and heat, and the communities in China and in Northern Europe dealing with housing lost to floods. We have a lot of work to do, and we are so grateful for your partnership and for our community that is with us tonight. Stewart.
I can't say much more than that, but please stay in touch with us through all the means that we have provided. Come back to us with the questions, come back to us with answers and actions and recommendations, and let's keep this going. A huge thanks to our speakers for the range of angles that they brought to this topic. We all know it and feel it in our heart, and we also feel that pressure globally that's coming at us. So looking forward to working with the rest of you as we continue this fight, and we'll see you on the next town hall, and please do come visit us on the LinkedIn site as well. Thanks to all of you. Have a good night, day, evening, wherever you are. Thanks very much.
Adiós, adiós, hasta luego.
Saludos, hasta luego.
Chao.
Suerte
Hasta
a
luego. Chao.
todos. Chao.
Much. See ya.
Ciao.